Hi, my name is James and welcome to King's Fine Woodworking. Today I'm going to show you how I built these shop stools, which would work equally well as bar stools. And they don't have to have a cushion on top, you could just as easily put a hardwood top up there. These stools are stackable and can be easily built to any height, and they can be made out of a variety of species. I did happen to use Purple Heart for mine, but any hardwood would do. In fact, you could even go to something like Home Depot and buy some pine 2x2s and make them out of that. I want to talk a little bit about a company who I personally asked if they would sponsor us. The company is MagSwitch. I've been approached 100 times in the last 2 years from tool companies trying to get me to take on a sponsorship. I've declined them all because their tools were mostly just mediocre. MagSwitch takes tools to a whole new level. They make your work faster, they make it more accurately, and most importantly, they make it safer. There's a link in the description below that gets you 10% off, and you'll be helping support our channel. And these things are awesome times two when you discover you can store them literally anywhere. Alright, so jumping back into the build here, this is actually a pretty straightforward build. It's pretty easily a weekend project. It could almost be done in one day if you didn't have to wait for some overnight glue-ups. So what I like to do to start with is I like to take and break it into sections. So you've got the legs, those are all four one length. You've got the upper rails, those are all one length. And you've got the lower rails, those are all one length. I like to cut those into an approximate rough length, and for me, rough means about an inch bigger than they need to be finished. So I did start with a lumber that was hit or miss plane, so it's pretty rough. So I'm going to go ahead and plane it down to 1.5 inches thickness, which is what I think is going to work perfectly for this. So I'll start by flattening one side, and then I'll jump over to my planer once I have one side nice and flat. And I will thickness it on the other side to get it down to 1.5 inches thick. I do have detailed plans for this project if you're interested, and there is a link in the description below to get those. And we used Purple Heart. Purple Heart is definitely overkill for a project like this, but my wife and daughters really are big comic book fans, and they just thought this color would be great. My wife has some fabric that we're going to put on some foam cushions up top that are based Marvel theme, and so everybody thought the purple would look great with it, so I went with that. After establishing our thickness, I'm going to go back to the jointer and I'm going to joint one edge to get it perfectly square, 90 degrees to the two faces that we just surfaced and thicknessed. And whenever we get the chance, we really like to use these special tools that a friend of mine, Andy Klein, invented. And these basically allow you to keep your hands well away from the blade while you are jointing the edge of a piece of wood. They're super cool, and if you don't know who Andy Klein is, then you should. You should check out his channel. I'm going to put a link to his channel in the description below. It's pretty cool. He's an amazing inventor and builder, and he does some really cool stuff. He also happens to work with MagSwitch, which is one of the reasons that I really like MagSwitch products. Okay, so here's a quick glance at all of the rough lengths that I have done. They're all milled to the exact thickness that I need them at, and now I'm going to cut them into the correct widths. This is going to leave me with a bunch of 1.5 inch squares. Of course, you don't have to use Purple Heart. Like I said, you can use any wood. You can use a hardwood, or you can use a good quality softwood. If you go down to your local big box store, you can probably find some 2x2s. If you can find some out of Douglas fir, you could just make the stools out of that. It would work perfectly well. I have no idea how they came up with the name MagSwitch for their tools here, but I do know that they are basically magnets that you can turn on and off with a switch. And you certainly don't have to use a MagSwitch product necessarily, but you should use a featherboard. This is their Universal Featherboard Pro. Whenever you're making a cut, one of the things that can trigger a kickback is if your wood doesn't stay nice and snug against the fence. These I just happen to like them because they're very easy to adjust, and they don't require you to use the miter slot in order to do so. And next we have a quick glance at all of the pieces once they're cut. And this is enough material here for me to make two stools out of. I'm making a taller one and a shorter one. The first thing I'm going to do is cut the legs. And the legs have to have both a bevel and a miter on the chop saw. So you really do have to have a compound miter saw because this is a compound cut. And the first thing I'm going to do is just chop the end off. And remember, I cut all these legs a little over an inch longer than what they needed to be. And then I'm just going to slide it straight forward to a stop that gives me my predetermined length for the stool. and then I'll chop the bottom part off. And this way, by doing it this way, not rotating the board and just sliding it over, it's going to give me the correct slant that I need in order to make this leg. So the leg has to tilt in by a certain number of degrees and has to tilt to the side by a certain number of degrees. And it's 7 degrees. I'm not trying to keep that secret or anything, but that's the size that we chose. But if you follow this methodology, you'll get perfect legs. They'll be cut just right. So once I've cut all of the legs, both the tall ones and the short ones for the 2 different height stools that I'm making, then I'm going to remove the bevel cut and just leave the miter cut. And this is what I'm going to cut, how I'm going to cut the rails. The rails simply have a miter cut. There's no bevel cut to them either. And the miter cut, of course, has to be the same as the rails because it's got to slope in by that same amount. And did you notice what I did there? As I slid that over, I had to flip it or roll it forward by 180 degrees in order to keep that miter basically going the same way. So we end up with a trapezoid piece. So watch here again. So I've got my miter cut here. Then I'm going to slide the piece straight forward, and then I'm going to roll it forward twice before I make the second cut. By doing that, I'm going to put all of the rails in the correct orientation. Here I'm going to take a quick look at the top rails for one of the stools. So I'm going to put them in roughly the right spot. You know, the front and back are a little wider than the 2 sides. But then we're going to look specifically. The rails have to go like this, with the angle, the 7-degree angle has got to slope in that direction. And you can see here if I put a square to it, you could pretty easily see which way that has to slope. And it slopes the same exact way on the other side. So we'll put that in the right orientation. And I'm going to take the time to mark this out and show you exactly what we're doing because the next cut's a little tough. So this way would be wrong. Of course, that would be upside down. And of course, that would be wrong. And this is the right way. So I know this seems a little bit silly, but it's important to do this layout so that you know exactly what's happening. Of course, it's the same on the other side since the face of this rail is a trapezoid. Now I'm going to go ahead and do a full layout of the top rails for this particular stool. I want to make sure I lay them all out correctly with the top side of this top rail up and the bottom side down and the inside in, because I actually have to put a bevel along the length of these tops because I want them to be flat in a flat orientation in 3D space for when I put the top of the seat on. So once I have these laid out, I've identified what's what. I'm going to go ahead and write on them. This is the top. Now these are the top rails, not the bottom rails, so they're longer. This is the inside of this top rail. You can barely see that on camera there. And then of course I have the bottom side of this top rail. I'm going to take the time to lay that out on all of them so that I can make my bevel cut. Okay, so watch my orientation on the table saw. I have the top side facing the blade and the inside facing up. I'm going to set my table saw at 7 degrees to match the orientation of this cut. And the top side is facing the blade and the inside is facing up. And I'm putting a 7-degree bevel along the whole side here of that rail. I'm going to do the same with all of the rails, always putting the top facing the blade and the inside facing up. If I didn't take my time and carefully lay out the orientation of each of these top rail pieces and identify which faces were which, I might have made a mistake at this point in the build, and then I would have to start all over and make some fresh new legs and rails again. That saved a lot of time. Now I want to clean this face up, and I'm just going to hold it flat on the jointer. You could sand it, of course. Purple Heart's a little harder to sand, but I've just set my blade for about a 64th of an inch and just enough to clean off those burn marks. And now you'll see what that bevel was actually for. Here's a quick glance so that you can clearly see the bevel and what it looks like. And I'll put these things back in their correct orientation. And we'll kind of look at the top rails after we get these in place, and you'll see how it works. Notice that's the inside. And of course the word top has disappeared from the top because I cut it off. So before I make any mistakes, I'm going to take a minute and go ahead and write the word top back on each of these. That's going to help me at a future stage when I go to join these pieces together. I understand a lot of the effort that goes into this build is just doing the layout and carefully marking everything, but if you take the time to do that, it really does make it easy. And you can see when these tilt up in order to match the legs, which bevel out, that makes the tops flat. And here are the legs. Now I've oriented them in such a way that all of those points come together in that central corner there, and when they all protrude out like that, that helps me identify that this is the top of the legs. And then the bottom of the legs looks the exact opposite. The point is kind of going inward instead of sticking out. And you need to set the legs up in this orientation in order to put a taper on the bottom of the legs. We're going to have to identify, this is kind of like a shaker taper. We're going to have to identify what parts to cut off for that. So if you have them in this orientation, spread them apart, and we're going to put an X. That X and that X, those are the two sides we're going to taper. Now those two X's basically faced another piece of Purple Heart, another leg. And you see how they come together there, and then of course the same thing on the top. I want to put X's there, and those X's would have faced the X's down below, and then the X's on the inside also face each other. And we'll put it all back together in the correct orientation that it was just a second ago. And just like that. So now all of the X's face each other. That's basically the inside four sides of the legs. And those are the ones that get the edges that get tapered. Tapering's optional. You definitely don't have to do it. I think it makes the stool look a little bit more elegant. If you went with a pine leg or a thinner leg, or a weaker material, I suppose, maybe a taper is not a great idea. But for any hardwood, you can taper it no problem. If you have really stout softwood, you could taper it as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to taper it. We use a tapering jig. I do have a video on how to make this tapering jig. It's really, really easy. And we're going to set this up so I just taper the bottom 5 inches of the leg. And I'll put it in the orientation first so that the bottom X is down and then the other X is facing straight out. And the taper is just going to cut that X right off. And I'll show you how that works. We put it in the jig, we get it clamped down, raise the blade up just high enough to cut that off. And it's pretty straightforward. It goes forward and just takes the bottom 5 inches of this off. You can take off as much or as little as you want. I just set it up in the jig so it took this amount off. But when that's done, we'll loosen up our clamps here, and we'll rotate this leg now, and we'll grab the X on the other side. And that's how it's really hard to keep this all in mind when if these pieces are just floating about your shop. But if you put them together in the orientation I had before and make sure that the X's all face each other, you're not going to make any mistakes as to which edges to cut off. And when you're done, the tapering will be perfect. And that's that. It's real simple to taper all the legs this way. And like I said, it adds a kind of a nice elegant touch to the legs. It's very subtle, but it's kind of a good look overall. And you can see as the leg slants in there, it's got a slight taper at the bottom. Okay, here's a quick look at the 8 legs for both stools that have the tapers at the ends already cut. And you can see those are the bottoms because you can kind of see the concave shape there. And of course the top still has its convex shape. And here's another glance at the top rails. And I'm going to go ahead and actually mark them with magic marker so that they can be seen a little bit easier for the rest of the video. I should have done that earlier, and I didn't. It's probably a little harder to sand off. That's why I think I did mark it. But you can see, so there's the legs. Here's a set of top rails. And then, of course, the set of lower rails, which are naturally a little bit bigger since the legs splay out. And the top rails, of course, when the rail tilts up in order to match the taper or the profile of the leg that bends out, it becomes flat on the top. And if you're not sure exactly what I mean, here's an example. Here's a leg, and it's tilting in at its little 7-degree tilt. And when we take the top piece and put it up there, now, of course, this system is completely flat across the top, which will hold our flat board on the top, whether using a cushion or otherwise. And that's how that mates together. Now I'm going to mark the locations for either putting in dowels or dominoes. I've got two squares here. They're double squares. I've got this small one which I've set to basically half the distance down that rail, and the other one which I'm going to line up flush with the outside to draw a straight line here, and that's kind of like the center point. Well, my pencil broke. That's like the center point for where I want these dominoes to go. You could use dominoes or you could use dowels, like I said. So there's the center point. And we're going to flip this over to the other side. And we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to mark the center point over here. So I've got one of my double squares here that's kind of going to give me a little quick mark at the halfway point. Just kind of saves time, and I've got the other one to really draw the straight line. The straight line needs to be parallel with the outside of the leg. That's where perpendicular, I'm sorry, with the outside of the leg. That's why I'm using it that way. And it seems I grabbed the broken pencil again there. And it goes like that. You can see it's not straight necessarily with the longitudinal axis of that rail, but it is perfectly 90 degrees with the edge of the leg. And then I'm going to identify what's what. Once again, lots of marking in order to ensure accuracy. So these two A's sides are going to mate together, and I'm going to show how they're going to mate. Basically, that edge is going to mate with that edge. And one last important thing is I'm actually making the marks for the legs for the front and back rails, not the side rails. Side rails we'll do last. So I've got the top one marked. Now I'm going to mark the bottom rail. Bottom rail, I've got a specified distance down that I'm going to use, and I'm going to go ahead and measure out that distance. It's 12 inches here in my case, and that's going to be to the top of that rail. And then I'm just going to real carefully draw a straight line at that 12-inch mark, and I'm going to roll that line around a couple of sides here. And that's going to help me put the side rails in later also. So remember, we're just doing the front and back rails now. We're going to join the front and back. And this is what the leg thing is going to look like when it's all done. I've got them all marked out, or at least the top portions marked out. Now I'm going to mark out the bottom portion. And I wanted the line to come to the top of the rail. So I've got the same thing here. I've got my square here that's going to give me a quick mark at about the halfway point up the rail. It just saves time. I could eyeball it, but I think I'm going to go ahead and put it right in the dead center, so I went ahead and set that up. And then, of course, I'm going to mark a straight line, and that line has to be perpendicular to the outside long axis of the leg there. So if you butt it up the way I did, it'll be perfect. Once again, I'm going to need to identify what this is. I'm giving this the letter Z, and I'm putting two arrows facing each other. It's a little hard to see since it's pencil, but that's letting me know that that belongs there. And then I need to flip it around to get a mark on the other side. So I think it's real important to be careful how you do this and don't mess up when you rotate it. And I have already marked the other side. I don't know if you can see that there. And then I just need to clamp it down and put my dominoes in, or you'll need to use your doweling jig and put your dowels in. So I'm purposely drilling the bottom one first just to confuse people and make people ask me questions. It actually doesn't matter if I had the depth set for shallow and I flipped it around, or I had the depth set for deep and I flipped it around. I just did this for controversy. See, I'm a controversial person. That's why I did that. Then we'll flip the board over, we'll clamp it down, and I will drill the other set of holes. And of course, if you're going to use dowels, then you still want two dowels because you don't want that rail to rotate on you. And if you have a doweling jig, you can figure that out however you want to put the two dowels. But dowels are just as easy to use as a domino joiner, and they're really just as strong. I would use a pair of 3/8 inch dowels, and it'll be rock solid. And now we need to put the complementary holes into the end grain of the rails. And you can see one of the reasons that I had to go perpendicular with the edge of the leg was so that it would be perpendicular to the edge of the face of this end grain here. So the dowels are effectively going straight in. They're maintaining that same angle. So even if you put a bevel, it works fine as long as you stay perpendicular to the edge of that edge of the rail. And then it's time for my favorite part of any job, and that's the glue up, of course. It's one where we get to use lots and lots and lots of glue in order that it stay really, really, really strong. So this is an exotic, and so I did use a little bit of acetone to clean out these holes with in case there were any excess oils that might inhibit my glue from bonding well. Purple Heart doesn't have a lot of oils like many exotics do, and you don't have to really worry about that problem with domestics at all, but should you decide to make one of these out of exotics, like Padauk for example, some of them are fairly oily and you wouldn't necessarily get a good bond unless you acetoned off some of the excess oil first. I want to give a shout out to the members of our King's Fine Woodworking community group. It's a group on Facebook that is basically a closed or a private group where woodworkers can get together with other woodworkers, share information, share projects. You can share your work, you can ask questions, you can answer questions if you have the knowledge, and it's just a great place for woodworkers to hang out. I'll put a link to that in the description below in case anybody's interested in checking that out. I'm in there myself answering questions about 20 hours a week, and it's just a pretty fun place to hang out. Alright, so when it comes time to clamp these up, I've got a couple of wedges here that were basically cut-offs from my tapers on the bottom, and that kind of helps square out the top a little bit, which is allowing me to get a nice secure clamp going on this. And of course we've got some good squeeze out there, which is important, lets me know that the joint was thoroughly covered, but I knew that anyway. I put too much glue, that's how I knew that. Of course, it's important to clean off all the excess squeeze out with a wet rag, otherwise you're going to have problems with your finish later. But I've never had any trouble getting that cleaned off, with a damp or a slightly wetter rag. And then we'll clamp the bottom one down, clean the glue off of that, and we'll basically let it set up overnight. So it really just took a few hours to cut all the pieces and to glue up the fronts and backs of the two different stools. I let those set up overnight, and now it's the next morning. I'm going to go ahead and pull the clamps off, and then we can proceed with the next stage of the assembly. And we can take a quick look at what the two sides look like when they are up in the correct orientation. And they'll look a little something like that. Now all we need to do is put in the side rails, the upper and lower side rails. And here's basically how those will go. So the upper rail does have to be put in line with the other upper, but the lower side rail will actually come above the other one. That way I can get two dominoes in this one without really shearing into the existing dominoes that are already in place from the lower front and back rail. It'll just make for a little bit stronger of an assembly. And the upper one I don't really have that ability. Because it does need to come in line with that. So this one I'm actually only going to put one domino, and I'm going to put it more towards the outside, not towards the inside. So I still get the bulk of the strength from the two dominoes from the front on the inside. So this one I'm just going to have a single domino towards the outboard edge, and you'll see what that looks like in just a second. Well, if you've made it this far, thank you very much for hanging out and watching. I know my videos are kind of long sometimes. I just like to give real detailed explanation. And I wanted to say hello and thank you to all of my Patreon subscribers. All you guys really mean the world to me. Everything that you do really helps support our channel a lot. It makes a big difference in what we can do. And in fact, this project was one that was actually recommended by a Patreon supporter, and we needed some stools, so that's really why we're doing it. So thanks again, everybody, for helping us out there. And if anyone else was interested in supporting this channel, other than buying things from the people who sponsor us like MagSwitch, Patreon is a fantastic way to do it. There are links to our Patreon page in the description down below. Thanks. I probably talked too much there, but hopefully you could see how I just had a single domino at the top, and it was more towards the outer edge. and that kind of saved my inner dominoes from the front and back rails from being cut up too much. And this is still going to really provide plenty of strength for this structure, because in addition to the upper rails the way they are with a single domino, they're also going to be all attached together with a piece of plywood on the top with screws. And the next step is to clamp this top portion down. I'm going to try to use those same wedges there. That's going to help us out, and we're going to let this sit up for about 5 or 6 hours before I continue to put on the tops. We'll start getting the glue cleaned off, and then we'll go ahead and clamp the bottoms together as well. And a good reason to have an assembly table like the one I have here is you can see that all 4 of my legs are nice and flat, perfectly to the surface of the table. Having a torsion box assembly table lets you do that and make sure that your stools and chairs and tables and things that you build don't rock. So an assembly table is a good thing to have in a shop. So it's all dried, and I am pulling it apart, and I'm going to do a little bit of finish and detail work on this before I put the tops on. So I decided to use a 1/4 inch radius roundover bit on this because I didn't want something too big and I didn't want something too small and not noticeable. And I think in the end it ended up being the right look for what I had in mind. Basically I hit every edge that I could possibly hit with my router, and then I sanded the corners that I couldn't quite get to with the router. The only thing I left untouched really was the very top, the top edge of it, because I wanted that to stay flat for the seat. I even rounded off the bottoms of the legs so they weren't sharp and square all the way to the bottom, so the edges didn't tend to chip when the stool gets slid around on the concrete. Now it's time to move on to the seats themselves. I am going to use 3/4 inch plywood here. This is some stuff I had sitting in the yard. You can see it's kind of got some mud on it. It is good quality ply. It's actually Baltic birch, and I don't know why I had it sitting outside, but I did. So it's going to take some sanding to clean it up a bit. But I'm also tapering the outside edges at that same 7 degrees. Hopefully you can see that. I've got my saw tilted at 7 degrees, and I've got so that's got the taper all the way around. And you can see once I set it on here that it fits the edge of the stool just right. Of course, we're going to put a foam block on top of that and then wrap fabric around it before we attach it. But that's the gist of it there. Now, since I'm going to have fabric wrapped around this really tightly, I don't want the fabric to tear as it goes around sharp edges and sharp corners. So I'm going to take a few minutes. I'm going to sand the corners into sort of a radius round that matches the legs on the stool. Then I'm going to flip this board upside down, and I'm going to use my router and put a radius roundover on the bottom edge, since the fabric is going to be stretched down over that edge. And this is just the same 1/4 inch radius roundover bit here that I'm using. And that's just going to make a nice smooth transition when the fabric gets stretched over there, so the fabric doesn't tear, because it's going to be under a lot of tension. I'm going to try to stretch it nice and snug to get underneath there. So this is my wife Rupa. This is her fabric. This is her choice of fabric for the stools. She sits in the stool a lot when we're out there. She does all of our filming. So if the filming of this part is crappy, then you know why. It's because she was busy doing this, and I'm the one doing the filming. So I think we cut these to be about 3 feet by 3 feet square, and then that's how we're going to build them. These are of course our Marvel superheroes. All my girls, my wife included, are really into comic books. And Marvel in particular is particularly cool. So we flip that upside down, we put the foam on it, and we're just going to kind of measure, or I guess they are just going to kind of measure and get the foam roughly equidistant into the middle of that. Then we'll set the plywood base upside down there on top of that and get that nice and centered. Should have been the exact same size as the foam, but I think I made some miscalculation somewhere, so it's a tiny bit smaller. It turns out it didn't really matter. And Sai is going to stand up top and put a little bit of tension on that foam. This is the first of the 2 stools that we made, and this one is relatively low tension. We didn't know if we would like it better if it was under a lot of pressure or under a little. So this is the one that has just a little bit of pressure. And then we just folded it over, doubled the fabric there, and they're going to staple this down with 2 rows of staples all the way across each edge. Once the two outside edges are done, then they're going to fold up the middle edge here and try to create a nice pleat or a seam in the corner that looks halfway decent. And I think it actually looked pretty good in the end there. That's Maya trying to get that neat just the way she wants it. We probably could have used some lessons from some professional upholstery people out there, but we didn't get any, obviously, before we finished this. And one last thing that we did was to go through and hammer all of the staples down nice and tight so that they've got a little bit of extra friction holding them in securely, rather than just the holes themselves, which might be prone to tearing. And that's what that one looks like. And here's a quick glance of what it looks like in place on the stool. This is the looser of the two. Both blocks of foam were 4 inches tall. You could certainly use foam any height that you wanted. And the other one is the same exact type of foam, but it was compressed under more tensions. So I stood with a lot more weight on that one as we stapled that one down. And that's what that one looks like, all completed. And in the end, we think we like this look a little bit better. They're both about equal in terms of comfort, but those were the two choices there. Since there wasn't a whole lot of surface area for this project, we didn't really see the need to break out the big sprayer. It just took, I think, 2 cans total of lacquer to give 3 coats to the whole project this way. And you can see Maya did that for us in pretty short order. If you do decide to use lacquer, make sure you use a respirator. It's much safer. And that's what it looks like when it's all finished. And so now I'm just putting some holes in here in order to attach the screws from underneath to go up into that plywood. And this is one of the reasons why I said the rails don't have to be super strong, and I wasn't really concerned with just having a single domino on one of them, because we have 8 screws, and these are 2-inch screws. They're very heavy-duty screws, and we're going to countersink the top here. And we've got 8 screws kind of holding the whole system of all 4 rails up top together, which actually make it really strong. And you can see what it looks like here when it goes together. Maya's going to hold it down securely with a little bit of weight while I screw them in, and we'll put them in nice and snug. Of course, I made sure that the screw was not so long that it poked through on the foam on the other side. We wouldn't want to be sitting down on the edge and get poked with one of those. But in this case, of course, it took a 2-inch screw perfectly. And there it is with all 8 screws in place, and that is the completed stool. So all in all, a pretty cool project. It took us, I think, maybe 6 hours, 5 or 6 hours to make them in their entirety. Of course, over a couple of days since we had to have some waiting time for the glue up. But other than that, it's a real easy project. It's a nice shop project, and it's one that hopefully you enjoy. Thanks for watching.